Greetings, fellow soldiers. Welcome to Bitcoin Liberty Live. I'm Fritz with Satoshi's Militia, regular weekly video updates every week. I got my compadre Daniel with me. He's writing the book, The Great Realignment, available online on Medium and updates on X and everywhere else. A book in progress, and we're going to speak to some of that and also our thoughts as we go. We talk about history, the future, Bitcoin principles, and everything else under the sun. So what's been going on in your world the past week? You were on a podcast with Ryan Mata,
Yes.
right?
Yeah, Ryan Mata very generously had me on his podcast last Wednesday. He's got quite a following. I was pretty surprised that he wanted to talk to me at all, so. But he was a great guy. He was really awesome. We had a really good chat, and we were talking about all kinds of stuff. I mean, we sort of drifted into Bitcoin and some criminal justice stuff, and yeah, I mean, it was.
And he reached out to you because he saw your book or a connection?
I don't know. I don't know if he saw the book or if he just found me on Twitter somehow. Apparently he talks about a lot of sort of conspiratorial stuff sometimes, and apparently he gets, as he puts it, put in timeout on Twitter.
Yeah.
But I got a notice from one of his secondary accounts that he uses, like when his main account gets put in timeout. And when I looked at the profile, it had like 130 followers or something like that. I'm like, what is this thing? And for a second I thought like this guy was just trying to hustle me or something. But then he messaged me back with his main account, and I was like, oh, okay, this guy's legit, and I wanted to go talk to him. But there's a few guys that I follow on Twitter that he had already interviewed, and I was like, oh, this guy's, he's got a pretty cool show. He's super interesting. Perspective on things. He's working on a documentary now that's I think going to be awesome. Like the stuff he was talking about during the interview was pretty interesting, and some of the stuff we talked about after the interview was over, like it's super intriguing. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what he comes up with. But
he has a lot of followers, and looking at his channel, a lot of interesting topics, a lot of different content, guests. When you were on his show and I watched that, I thought it was great. I mean,
thank you.
Because he gets into your book. He, of course, curious about the background and career path, studying history, navigating school, getting into legal stuff, getting your degree in laws, and then starting into your Bitcoin path. Which, everyone's got their Bitcoin story. I have mine, and you have yours. And
exactly.
It merged at one point together where we were just convergent on a lot of interests that were quite aligned, because once you sort out Bitcoin, it starts to, all the various trails lead up to the same view at the top of the mountain there. So
yeah,
we're on our similar path now that way. You've got much more of a following on X, Twitter, and through Medium, a lot of content you've been writing. Me less so right now, but you're connecting with people on podcasts. Do you want to mention one coming up? You're going to Prague?
Oh, yeah. Well, I'm going to be at Bitcoin Prague this year. I'm super excited about that. Rozumím česky. I'm learning Czech as we speak. It's a tough language, and I also feel like it's kind of more respectful to show up and just not assume people are going to speak English with me. So we'll see how that goes. I got another 20 or 30 days to figure that out. But Robin Sayer, who's got an amazing podcast, he's actually going to be in Prague at the same time I am, and I'm going to be on his show on Monday, so I'm looking forward to that.
That's this summer.
Yeah, that's this summer, June 12th, I think, or 13th.
That's coming up.
Yeah, so it's pretty quick here. But Robin, his show, it was his podcast that I saw that first interview with Eric P. Stacks, which is a guy that's been pretty influential on me recently. And the guy's got this great, like really positive outlook on things. And he's a commodity producer, but he's full-on Bitcoin guy. And, he's like on a Bitcoin standard. And he had these really great takes. It was his ability to articulate stuff. It was so clear. And I still feel to this day super grateful, because I almost scrolled past the interview. I saw it and I kind of watched the first couple of minutes. I was like, I don't know if I want to watch this. And then I just something in me told me to keep watching, so I kind of stuck it out a little bit.
He's got the farm.
Yeah, he's a cannabis farmer, commodity producer, and I'm like I said, thank God I did, because he's really quite brilliant, and he was down at El Zonte. I think he was running around down there. I think Travis was down there, right? So yeah, so he was down there running around with the Bitcoin halving party down there, and posting some videos. But yeah, that's Robin Sayer's show, and he's had some amazing guests. So I feel really honored to be part of that show as well. I'm looking forward to sitting down and chatting with him. And he's just a great kid. He's super productive, and
Robin Sayer he's prolific in his videos and guests, and has great steady content. Like a lot of these guys do. I think of Peter St. Onge, and it's just every day they're cranking out quality, interesting, smart stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so it's exciting to be part of that, and I mean, for me, I'm all about just sort of pushing the Bitcoin message, and if I can add to that chorus of voices, and if I have anything to offer to it, I think it's ultimately for the benefit of all, And then, like I was sort of talking with Mr. Mata during our interview, everybody's got a different, slightly different angle on this stuff, right? I mean, you bring like a really unique voice with Satoshi's Militia and some of those videos, and
banned on TikTok, by the way. I don't know.
That's right.
the whole term militia, and I put in my profile, not a real militia, not seditious here, but it's just the spirit of Satoshi's army. This is like a grassroots local flavor of that spirit of freedom and independence, and doing our thing on our own locally as a militia, but it's that patriotic spirit. So I put some videos on TikTok, no views, absolutely nothing, just early stuff, and within like a day and a half, 2 days, your account is permanently suspended. And I'm like, why? What did I say? What did I do? It was like history videos, colonial patriotic history.
Yeah.
Nothing edgy there, and just some of it's out of just Wikipedia, literally. And so, but no, permanently banned, no recourse, just, why? Click. We'll incorporate your concern into our feedback. Excuse me. It's like, well, okay, I guess I'm just suspended. So.
Yeah, you got hit with the ban hammer.
I don't know why, but.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's, TikTok's up to their ears and God knows what now.
So in the U.S. government,
Yeah, so I don't know. I mean, I could only speculate, like, why they might drop the ban hammer on you. But, just getting auto-banned like that, I mean, I'm always, like, back in the day, I wrote a book about, like, acting, and, I was, like, studying acting at the time of all things. And I had spent a lot of time like doing keyword optimization, and this was back before like SEO was like a cottage industry, right? And I'd gotten my ranking for a select few keywords up to like the second page of Google search results, and then they changed the algorithm on me, and like I was probably selling like 30 or 40 books a month, and I was doing pretty good on my little e-commerce sort of get rich quick scheme. And just one algorithmic change, and it was like boom, just business gone. And I remember thinking, like, man, I just spent, like, all this time, like 2.5 years, like, learning how to code up websites and learning SEO and learning how to, kind of, I guess, for lack of a better term, like, game that algorithm. And to climb that hill and get all the way on the second page results, and it's like, oh, man, I'm almost on the home page, and this is going to be huge. And then just to have it get rug pulled like that, I was like, oh, it's kind of like building a business on a conveyor belt, and they can just sort of change the belt anytime, and you go, ugh.
Yeah, these platforms are so empowering. I mean, we can do this here now, but we are beholden to a private corporation that may have pressures from various regulations or laws, or they're profit oriented, so they may change algorithms to get more views for themselves. So
that's precisely what Google did. And now, like, I don't know if you've used Google search lately, but it sucks balls. I mean, like, you can't find anything, and
it's changed.
I remember when Google first came out, it was super remarkable. Like, me and all my tech buddies were like, yeah, this is great, man. Like, you can actually use a search engine, you'll find something worth searching for. Now all the results come back to like corporate media. I mean, it's all corporate oriented now. And
I scroll through a couple of ads before I get to like, what am I looking for?
Yeah, exactly. And the results are trash now, So like, I mean, you if you're looking for golf clubs or something like that, it's pretty good. But if you're looking for like, unique or sort of a little harder to find information, like Google search sucks and DuckDuckGo is a joke and Brave search is a joke. And it's like, oh, there's no search now. Like it's all busted. And it's all because of, profit margins and profit seeking and things like that. And understandably, they're running a business. But, and so how you can kind of get around those stumbling blocks, I guess, is proving to be tricky. But
yeah, it takes a little more thought process into finding quality, which I do want to get into the topic of quality later. I have a lot of thoughts on
interesting.
What is quality, and actually some books I've read about what that means, and not just from a very subjective viewpoint, but that objectively evaluating quality. What is quality? What I like about Nostr, say, I'm on Nostr a lot. It's a little more difficult to navigate or connect, and the UI, the UX is new and can be clunky, but it's just completely unfiltered. It's like Bitcoin. It follows the protocol, and no one owns it. It's decentralized authentically. People run nodes, and it is what it is. Now that said, you post something, you make a note, it's there forever. Everyone's got it. It's like it's on the blockchain. It's you can't go back and delete and edit. It's there.
Yeah.
So author beware, but it's authentic, and no one can shut it down. No one can censor it. So there's that.
Yeah.
So on the Nostr end of things, the concept of value for value is important. People I'll post something that resonates a little bit, and people will just send me through you connect the Lightning address to your account if you want, but people will just zap you sats, 21 sats. I mean, it's a nothing right now, and no skin off your back. But if you like something, it's like, oh, that's cool. Oh, I'm gonna copy that meme. I like it, and you zap them 21 sats.
Yeah.
I had something that somebody really liked, and they zapped me 1,000 sats. It's like value for value there. It's small, but it's just it's like liking something.
Yeah.
I like that, uncensorable, and now the outreach is different. You got to find out who you want to follow and who's going to follow you. It's just very organic and grassroots, and a smaller community.
Yeah.
But it's growing and stuff's building on it. When you connect with large outreach platforms, you got your YouTube and your X. You are beholden, like we said, to the company and what works for, say, the algorithm, or what do they filter. Or I figured, well, I'm on those, and I'm just going to see where do I get traction with what I'm making here. So I'm like, I don't like TikTok per se. I think there's a lot of, it's kind of oriented around garbage, but I'm going to put some videos, if they tolerate a few minutes on there. I'm going to put up some patriot history videos.
Oh, no, you're not.
No, apparently not. So there's that. I'm figuring this out, but that's the nature of the game. It's their platform. So,
well, that's kind of the funny thing about it is, like, I keep looking at Nostr and I go, I know, but it can't be censored, quote unquote, and yet I keep waiting for it to get sort of shut down, like in terms of traffic, right? Like, and if you think about
like too much overhead on it.
No, not the overhead. Like, there was a great episode of It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia ages back, and they said, yeah, man, like, we want freedom. Like, I think Charlie walked into the bar and someone was smoking. He was like, hey, man, you're infringing on my right to have free air. And go, hey, this is a free country, man. I should be allowed to smoke. And this was back when the smoking bans in bars were starting to become a thing, and people were getting a little tripped up about that. And, so there's that argument back and forth about where does the line of freedom and infringement come in, and that always gets to be tricky.
My rights versus your rights, and are we talking personally or environmentally?
Yeah, exactly. It's tough to parse out, right? And so they said, we're going to make our bar like a free, anything goes bar, And then Frank comes along and he's got like some gambling ring going downstairs, and they're like playing poker for like suicide is the prize and all this kind of, it was just completely out of control. And so, like, by the end of the episode, they're going, maybe, we shouldn't have so much freedom. And they had sort of come full circle about it, and everybody had gotten twisted around. But, that's the sort of problem with, like, you go, we want uncensorable communication. You go, okay, great. Well, in about 3 weeks, you're going to have, 40,000 child sex abuse material images on there, and you're going to have beheading videos, and you're going to have people selling dope and, screaming for mass murder in Islam, and, American troops getting blown up by, rockets, and I mean, all the Ukraine combat footage, like all that stuff is just going to flood the network, right?
The lowest common denominator and the worst stuff will be there.
Yeah.
And
right.
so there's porn on Nostr, and I don't even know what else. What I do like about Nostr is that it's harder to necessarily. So what you're used to with a lot of social media is that stuff kind of just comes to you.
Right.
On X, it'll kind of push you towards kind of what's happening generally if you're in the other tab. And I'll see stuff that generally is pretty of my interest, and other times it's like, why am I seeing this? Oh, I'm in the For You area.
Right.
You may like this stuff. And I'm like, sometimes. Nostr doesn't have that exactly.
Right. Well, there's no algorithm, right?
Yeah, there's no algorithm. So finding what you want to find is harder. Or you got to know, like, what's that person's NPub? Or I got to find it. Or I got to find a follower that follows them. And then when I see it, I can follow them. And it's not as discoverable.
Right.
But you can go to the global view if you want. And I don't go there because I have, and there's a mess. And it's kind of a joke, but I mean, you go on there and it's like, whoa, there's somebody's boobs. Yeah, okay. Back to my following.
Yeah, my bubble.
So you want a bubble. You have a bubble. But so the discovery is tighter that way, but when you have your bubble developed, you're getting clear signals from what you want. Right. And if you don't want it, you drop it. But that said, it takes a little more responsibility, say, of like it's not necessarily a platform that you're going to send a kid to go, get on Nostr and play around.
Go explore.
They're exposed to whatever's happening in the world is there.
Yeah.
For adults, you follow who you want to follow. Yep, there's a hot mess over on the global side, but if you know what you're looking for and you can manage that or want to be responsible for your mental health, it's your control. Right. But in that regard, self-management, but then no regulation.
Right, yeah. Well, that's where it gets sort of, I mean, we'll see how it develops. I'm sure that's going to end up being a preferred means of communication, but when, the government censorship complex comes in and decides to start hammering and monkey hammering around, like, I think, like, if you look at the quote-unquote dark web, like, the Tor onion layers and stuff like that, like, it's just inundated with shit, and it's basically pointless to go even mucking around in there. And I don't know if Nostr is destined for the same fate. I mean, I think there is some accountability to the people that are posting, unlike the Tor sites and things like that, where they got to, like, law enforcement and stuff has to dig a little bit to get to the bottom of it usually. But it's there's those trade-offs, and like I think we talked about it last time with like the libertarian, meets a bear, runs into a bear, or something like that, and it's like, there's a reason why people put restrictions on things, because they kind of go, we didn't, like, you go, everybody should have freedom to do whatever they want, and then next thing you know, you got like, you got lions walking down the street because someone let their lion out, and you're just going, that lion mauled a bunch of people. Whose lion is it? It's Tom's. Well, who's going to stop Tom from doing that? So
I think there's a lot, and I want to have. So our buddy Travis is libertarian and a long time Bitcoin maxi, and I want to have him here one of these days. He wants to be on our show at some point, and I want to have a discussion about libertarianism.
Yeah,
it's a wide facet of views, as you know.
Yeah.
You're more knowledgeable about it than I am, because people, on one hand, you can say, well, you either have like central controls and regulations, or is it anarchy, or how do libertarian values spawn in a free market in a way that really the people want, that's also not, when you talk about in your book power, isn't tribal, just its own kind of fiat, local small time fiat.
Yeah.
So now in between, if you had a libertarian society that had worked it out and grown its roots and had developed systems that worked in a free market, say, that filled the gaps, that wasn't like, well, good luck, free for all on your own, or nope, now we have a big central control that sort of sets the tone all the time because they have power. Is there in-betweens there that work in a libertarian framework that are what we would want and are more equitable, say, or egalitarian?
Yeah, I don't think so, honestly. I mean, now that
Travis would disagree.
and
I think
Travis would disagree,
That
yeah.
would be an interesting conversation.
And yeah, we'd probably fuss a little bit about that. And yet that was my sort of worldview as well. Like I shared his distinct worldview very clearly, like back in the 90s. And it was through the study of law that I kind of went, oh, yeah, that just can't work. You know, I mean, like, and it sort of suffers, or at least the purity of that ideology sort of suffers from the same errors and flaws that like communism does, you know, because there's always this like, well, if everybody would just follow the rules of communism, we would have this perfect utopian society. But it's just these people keep trying to screw up communism, and that's why it doesn't work. And I recall like going to libertarian meetings, and like when I was running for office, I was talking to a lot of libertarians at the time. And I recall that same sort of sentiment. Well, if everyone would just be libertarian, then we wouldn't. If they would just respect other people's rights, and I go, well, but you're asking much of very little.
Can we all just get along?
Right?
No,
yeah,
we're not gonna.
Clearly, and there are people that will just sabotage that just for the joy of it.
There are toxic people.
Yeah, toxic people, trolls,
horrible people in the world.
Well, the ultimate problem is they're all fundamentally predicated on not necessarily true concepts. That's kind of what I'm talking about in the book right now in terms of power. Because if you look at like power structures and how they developed in the West, and then you start tracing that back through the history of how that developed, you go, all right, well, they made a fundamental error back in the day where they said, hey, it's normal for people to compete for resources. And you go, no, it's not. That's not fundamentally true about human beings. And they carry that error forward to this day, and you hear people go, well, war is inevitable, and men have always fought wars, and you go, no, they haven't. That's not true. That's just fundamentally not true. That's not the entirety of the history of the world. It is pretty true for the last 1,000 or 1,500 years, 2,000 years, 4,000 years, but human history goes back a lot longer than that, and it's not necessarily the way all human beings globally have operated. And so the idea that competition is fundamental to human beings is not correct. Like, we're a cooperative species. Like all pack animals, we cooperate. Like if you go, they talk about dominance hierarchies and wolves, and you go, well, they're not really. They're a collective cooperative species that hunt collectively and cooperatively. Human beings are the same thing, and like the example I give in the book, I go, if you, or I actually am changing the example a little bit here. I go, if I dropped you off in the Canadian wilderness with your worst mortal enemy from your office or whatever, the person that you just hate the most in the world, and they happen to be really good at trapping animals, and you happen to be really good at tracking and directions, are you guys going to separate and go, I hate you so much, let's just go our separate ways and figure it out? Or are you going to try and work together? Because you're going to die on your own.
You're not going to hate them over having a stolen stapler anymore because you're living.
You're on the survival threshold, right?
Yeah.
And so if you guys have half a brain in your head, you're going to put aside those differences. I mean, you can always duke it out when you're done, right? But in the meantime, it's like, all right, we need to figure out how to get through this without, killing each other. Or maybe you're just such egotistical people that you just end up killing each other anyway, and you die out in the wilderness for no good reason. But generally speaking, when people find themselves in those situations, they band together and they start doing stuff, right? And I think if you just look at the history of humanity, like Dr. Robert Sapolsky wrote in his book, Behave, the biology of humans at their best and their worst. And that guy's a brilliant lecturer. I recommend everybody check out some of his lectures around that book and the work he's done. But he points out, like, these old native tribes back in the day, like, they wouldn't... I'm going to preface this by saying the historical record is spotty. It's really difficult before people started writing stuff down to figure out exactly what people were doing.
Oral traditional stuff. And
right. And so
happened.
A lot of that is based on archaeological records, and those are very incomplete, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And yet, for the people that have bothered to try, they go, how much wide-scale conflict was there prior to agriculture? And they go, not a lot. Like almost none. There would be people fighting over stuff, like, hey, that's my girlfriend, no, it's mine, and they go duke it out. But this sort of wide-scale, coordinated combat warfare style kind of stuff just didn't really happen that much because it doesn't make any sense unless you have resources that you are securing and trying to prevent others from accessing, right? So once you have sort of resource capture as a central tenet to your philosophy about life, the reasons for conflict diminish greatly.
Do you think that, I think of the fall from the Garden of Eden, say, but do you think that when conflict was just widely dispersed and kind of we're just living off the earth, to agriculture, agrarian societies, centralized stores and security and settlement, that the conflict just kind of got centralized? And then the conflicts are bigger and you have battles and wars and kings?
Well, there is some research out there that says, like, if you look at, like, China, for instance, right? They had a similar structure to, like, early, like, Europe. The difference between the two societies and how they ended up developing, you can almost trace to the types of crops that they raised and the way they got their animal proteins, right? And, like, a lot of the religious and philosophical philosophies that dominate the West, like Europe and the United States, Canada, came from Christian philosophy, Christian ideology, things like that. But if you look at what their forebears were dealing with when those religions were coming into fruition, they tended to be shepherds, which is like one person leveraging herd animal behavior so they can collect a lot of animals that they can eat and leverage for food and whatnot. And you also had wheat was a primary crop. Like grass grains were primary food staples, right? But that doesn't take a lot of people to harvest grass because it just grows. It's practically a weed, By contrast, if you look at the Eastern societies, they were coming up around rice. And you go, well, how do you harvest and plant and tend to rice? You go, that takes everybody. Like
that's
an enormously labor-intensive crop. And everybody has to participate in collecting and producing that, or you just don't get it. And likewise, and especially in the coastal regions, a lot of their, food came from fishing, right? Which is also a group activity. Like, unless you have a Boston Harbor trolling boat, like everybody's got to get out there and haul in the nets and, get out. So there's a lot more collective action to get your food. And you can kind of see that in the way those philosophies and the religions and everything that developed around it. Like, for them, you get the balance and the sort of duality of, like, Taoism and Buddhism and things like that.
For the rice
and the fish and, like, how that all comes together because it requires collective effort, Whereas if you go to the Middle East and like, the area around the Levant where the Bible and all that sort of stuff came out, you go, what were their sort of gods oriented around? You go, well, it's someone came and bonked me on the head and stole all my goats, so now I want to go get vengeance and get my goats back. And when you start having that type of competition introduced into the food production and how you gather things, and if a strong man can come in and go, hey, I like that you have this big wheat field, I'm going to make it so you have to grow all this food for me, and if you don't, I'm going to bonk you on the head and I'm going to kill you. And so they can sort of extort you differently. But when it came time for, because both in the East and the West, they developed warfighting techniques and gunpowder and all that kind of stuff, and siege weapons. And the argument that the paper I was talking about a moment ago makes is that it was tournament-style competition in Europe that led to the advances in tactics and things like that ended up being able to overwhelm and overcome sort of Eastern resistance. Whereas in the East, all those sort of different factions, they didn't parcel off into like individual countries, nation states. They just combined all into one broad nation state like China or Japan or something like that. So it sort of changed the way they approached power and how they kind of arrived at these varying power structures. And I'm obviously glancing over like a ton of history and detail here. So broadly speaking, though, is kind of like how you can roughly trace out those different development paths. And now the world is very much dominated by a resource competition hierarchy, right? And with that comes all the attendant problems that come with resource dominant hierarchy, resource capture and dominance hierarchies. So
I think what's hard for people to sort of being advocate on Travis's point of view here, it's hard to reconcile how libertarianism would work when what we're used to is, in our modern age here in America, is a large and growing government, a lot of services and programs and supports handed to us with strings attached, say, or rules, but that we're used to that. And so it's a big bridge to cross if we were to have anything libertarian, that it's like, well, but somebody else has to be doing this stuff because I'm good for me doing my thing, but someone else's problem there. Somebody do something about that. And the collective sense of we all are kind of in this together as a community is hard, or not as natural when you're used to, you have that force or that program that takes care of this stuff. And our lives are not oriented around where we all participate in a lot of the little details together. We kind of have our silos and our roles, and our whole society is structured around professional silos or roles or living arrangements that, you're free to do you within this box. And when there's a problem, well, there's an authority that'll take care of that.
right.
And you expect that. The personal responsibility changes, where it's not that you're irresponsible necessarily, but you are accustomed to a responsible entity stepping in whenever for stuff.
Yeah.
Could we do that if there? I mean, I don't see how we really make that shift without something calamitous that forced the issue. But if you compare it to the Great Realignment, if Bitcoin were to push a change societally, would it start to look more that way, or would it be the same power structures, or would it become more libertarian?
Well, I don't think it would necessarily drift into libertarianism, right? What I do think it would do is start stripping away a lot of artifice around how we exist. And like right now, we're sitting in this building that is enormously wasteful and was built with not great design principles in it, right? Like if you just look at the heat and cooling envelope of this building, it requires extraordinary amounts of energy to heat and cool this structure that we're sitting in right now. And it requires extraordinary amounts of waste and things like that, so we can wear these clothes and we can buy mass-produced cars and we can drive on those roads. And the energy density that is required to create all this is enormous. And you go, so what incentivizes that? You go, well, kind of like the structure we're in and the gradual displacement of previous structures, right? There's a great website that talks about ancient technologies, and they go, like, you think about just the trucking industry. You go, well, is that the most efficient way to move goods around anywhere? Absolutely not. Clearly, like it's unmistakably a sort of wasteful way to get things around. But we use it because an auto industry came along and shuttered all the, like the public transit ideas so they could sell more cars. And through their government interference, they were able to get all these roads built at public expense.
We built interstate freeways.
Right, we built this entire structure around a horseless carriage. And you go, well, was that the best way to move stuff around? And one of the ancient technologies these guys were talking about, they said, look, if someone's mining up in, like there was, I think it was a Peruvian mine or something like that, they would put in these things that are called ropeways, and they're just little carriages that hang off like a tram, right? And that's how they'd move goods in and out of that, because you can't go up and pave a road through the middle of the Peruvian mountains just to get to your goal. It would cost you too much to get up there. But you can put up these little towers, these little ropeways. It's a very, very efficient way to move goods over long distances without bulldozing trees and paving roads and blasting through rock and all the crazy stuff that has to come with building a
Follow
road.
the contours of what was there.
Right, and just think like a ski lift, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, think about how much more resources it would take if you had to pave a walkway to get back to the top of the mountain, or if you wanted to put a motorized vehicle for every single person that wants to go skiing has to drive on this motorized vehicle up and down, and then you have to make 4-lane wide golf cart paths so you can get back to, or you just put them all on a conveyor belt, right? And that's the sort of difference.
Mm-hmm.
And they do that because it's far more efficient to move people that way. And so if you just look at the way our cities developed, if you look at the way commerce developed, you go, well, all this stuff is sort of corrupt to begin with. And what I think Bitcoin and that realignment does is, much like it's done for me personally and for most people who get into Bitcoin, it changes that time preference. It changes the way you look at value. It changes the way you think about saving. It changes the things that you want to buy. Like, if you talked to me 20 years ago, I was really into the idea of owning a brand new BMW every year, and I thought that was a big deal. And I thought it would be a really big deal if I got an American Express Black Card, and if I could go and afford champagne vacations to New York in some high-rise. And that all seemed really important to me, but that's because of the structure we've sort of developed, right? This very consumer-oriented, wasteful structure. And I think with that great realignment, a lot of those structures will just gradually dissipate because people will become less focused on that, right? And they'll become more focused on what you were starting to talk about earlier, which is things like quality.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of those ancient technologies, like if you think about pre-Depression era manufacturing, or the types of things that people would create for themselves, very, very, very durable. Like, just go look at a house that was, like, any Victorian era houses or whatever. I mean, these are just amazing craftsmanship, really.
Slower to build, more thought and work involved,
right?
And then, but it stands time versus, okay, we got a subdivision, we're going to build a whole bunch of a few models of a type of house, and we need them like in a couple of years.
Yeah, stamped out as quickly as possible, and like the cheapest, engineering we can come up with. But that becomes very wasteful, in terms of resource demand. And like, how many board feet of lumber does it take to build a house? And you go, well, how many trees do you have to cut down to get that? And then how do you get those trees to the place that's going to process them? And then how do you get that wood from there to here? And it's all based on petroleum, and it's all based on this like very abundant sort of cheap energy resource that they're now trying to curtail. And ultimately, a lot of this stuff sort of declines around that, right? So in terms of what I think it will end up doing is not necessarily that we end up in some libertarian free-for-all, and we don't also keep continuing to exist in a consumerist, wasteful, like if you just saw how many resources it takes for us to have a selection of clothes at the store, like, it's extraordinary. And if you go to Africa right now, you can see these dumping grounds of like name brands
the old
and
t-shirts and stuff.
Yeah, but I mean, now it's designer clothes are getting down there. Like, these things that would have cost you $300 for your pair of jeans or whatever, that stuff's showing up in Africa. They don't even want it anymore. It's just industrial waste. And you go, well, why do we have that? Because the economic structures and the economic incentives favor mass-produced shit that they can mark up to a certain profit level.
Sell here, and then it goes down the chain when
Right,
you got excess of stuff.
And they don't have to pay for the waste, right? Like, they don't have to pay the actual cost of what it costs to waste all that material. But if they had instead just made like sturdy clothes that would last you forever, you go, well, what happens to the clothing industry? It kind of goes away.
Fashion, I tell you, the whole idea of fashion too, it does promote and push that. I would call it high time preference and short term view. I mean, it promotes buying consumerism stuff now. It's in season, and then knowing that season is going to go, and what's next? Buy more. What's the latest?
Right.
Versus, I mean, you think, well, form should follow function. Oh, not in fashion.
No.
I'm no slave to fashion, obviously, but I'm just so practical sometimes. My wife will joke at me if I wear green pants with this orange shirt. She's like, green and orange? And I'm like,
yeah, what's
what?
It's
like, green doesn't go with orange. I'm like, oh, okay. But yeah, it drives high time preference.
Absolutely. And I think that's ultimately where we end up, is you end up with a world full of craftsmen, and people that are specialized and able to, like if you were able to earn a little Bitcoin and then keep it on your books, and then, if the marginal cost of production, as Jeff Booth continually says, is trending towards zero, and as some other well-known commentator, I can't remember his name right now, was saying, like, look, the cost of energy is trending towards zero. You go, well, then what's the world look like? And if there's robotics and AI and all that kind of stuff, you go, yeah, so if you need some cheap clothes, you can just get some.
Mm-hmm.
But then the things that are going to become highly prized are not going to be mass market, mass produced garbage. The things that are going to be highly prized are things like, this is a really well-tailored hand-stitched suit, or this is a really well-made handcrafted table.
Quality.
Yeah, so the nature of quality starts skyrocketing, right?
And that's what I wanted to get into a little bit with quality. We could talk extensively about resource usage, energy usage. Safedin has a book, Principles of Economics, and he's talked about it elsewhere about, there is a view that's sometimes promoted and pushed upon us about resource scarcity, and it kind of keeps us in that survival of the fittest mindset of, like, there's just not enough to go around. And he would argue there is plenty. And even with the weight of human bodies on the planet is approaching 8 billion or exceeds 8 billion, and it is just exponentially growing, which you could argue demographic and birth rate declines. But that energy use is not bad, and that improvements are occurring, and that things are becoming, they're growing into where it works and how it works, and Bitcoin stabilizing power grids, all that business. But that people often criticize the use or expense of resources, and granted, there is a huge amount of waste. So we can have what we have in a fashion designer sense at the expense of who is making this and where, in a warehouse in China.
Yeah.
Like, we can have what we have in a nice way and just think this is normal, not realizing that the nice shoes are actually getting sewn together and stuff on a track in China by people who are living a different life.
All right.
There's an inequity there, and at the same time, it could be done right and well in a way that there's not a limitation or a concern about the possibility of having enough resources. I read a book many years ago by Robert Pirsig, and he wrote The Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance.
Oh, yeah. I think
it's a great book. It's largely, partially about a relationship between a father and his son, and the challenge in that. And it's a personal story of his. I mean, it's written about fiction, but it very much stems from his personal life and his life experience, grappling with mental health issues, but also being kind of a genius in his own way. That it basically gets down to quality. What is quality? It's one of those things that it's like, it when you see it. Some people don't have as much of a strong sense about it, or their goals and values, like you mentioned back in the day. I wanted that new BMW. Is that quality? Depending on the frame of view you have, maybe. But, like, what is quality?
All right.
He wrote a follow-up book called Leela that extended upon quality as being something that can be made objective, that you can objectively measure and determine quality. Pirsig being a professor at a couple of different universities, but he would talk about quality and how you can know what it is, know it when you see it, but define it and measure that. What is quality? And there's a low time preference to that. It's quality over time.
Right.
It's not about, I got something now. Like, sugar is quality because it gives me energy and it's quick and fast and inexpensive. That's quality, right? Well, there's a time preference thing there. What is wholesome quality in the long term? Maybe like nutrition versus just calories.
Sure.
His book Leela gets into kind of the metaphysics of quality, which he calls morals. That morals can be based on our sense of what quality is. Quality extending into our social relationships, how we interact with the world, how we raise our kids, what we consume, how we live our lives, just quality, attention to detail, and awareness, having awareness of quality instead of kind of, oh, I can see my quality right here. I want quality just right here. It's like, no, kind of a comprehensive awareness of what quality is in a wholesome way all around. So his book, Leela, I have to look at my notes because I'm not that much of a genius, but he compared the interaction between what he called the difference between intellectual patterns and social patterns, where social patterns from like a kind of a Victorian era or a legacy history where, you know, you followed suit with what was happening at the time and you wanted to fit in, and part of the get along survival viewpoint was that as being part of your community, you're fitting in socially, and culture was more kind of top-down hierarchy of you're born in this era, you follow suit. And that with science and other, I mean, I could say lately, technological developments, that the intellectual part started to rear its head and say, despite all social norms, we know these other things to be true that are sometimes fly in the face of social norms.
Mm-hmm.
So he says that up until the end of the Victorian era, that social patterns dominated the conduct of American culture, and that in the aftermath of World War I, the intellectual patterns of the scientific method acceded to that position. So they became more responsible for directing the nation's goals and actions. There was a lot of science going on here. Later occurrences of fascism are seen as an anti-intellectual struggle to return to old social patterns that were of a dominant position. He mentions the hippie movement, and I can get into this. My parents were both hippies. I'm not condemning that or judging that at all.
I do. Sorry.
We can talk about that.
Yeah.
Now, I do too,
Right,
but
no.
and my parents are both now reformed hippies in their own way.
Right.
But at the time, I think if I was a kid growing up in the 60s,
You can kind of see
if
why they're
I'm
getting
using
on
my
board.
brain and I criticize a criminal government and the Vietnam War, I'd be a hippie, I think.
Oh.
Now, outcomes of that, you know, we can talk about.
Sure.
He says that the hippie movement, having perceived the flaws inherent in both social and intellectual patterns, sought to transcend both of those. But they failed to provide a stable replacement, and they degenerated instead to lower level biological patterns. Think sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
Yeah. Hedonism.
Hedonism. So it's like, you know, science authoritarianism, old social construct, 50s era social conformism. It was like, no, we need something better, something good. And with that, I would say came a high time preference, where it was kind of like, what makes me happy now? In revolutionizing against the man, you know, and where do you start? And it's new. You're often probably sorting it out as you go, but it could be very kind of short-term thinking. Right now, fight the man. That evolving into something of a low time preference, longer time frame span. As far as quality, transcending into a set of morals that aren't high time preference, but instead are healthy and wholesome for society long term.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I see a parallel in with Bitcoin promoting as from a foundation of what is kind of drives a lot of things in our world, which is money.
Yeah.
Money in our economics.
Yeah.
That's where I wanted to go with quality. I mentioned it also because Robert Breedlove had a podcast on recently with they were talking about fiat food and healthy food. Actually, stuff you've talked about before with people measuring in depth what they're eating, vitamins they're taking, health they're doing with a lot of data. You mentioned that to me before.
Yeah.
And he interviewed a doctor named Paul Saladino about getting away from fiat food, eating healthy, wholesome, nutritional food, and what drives both our cheap, low-quality food and why it's so hard to make the transition just with the food we eat, how to do that healthily, feel better all around, even as it's just not as easy as succumbing to something quick, cheap, and easy. You know?
Correct. Yeah, I agree. Well, I mean, I think we all collectively get tripped up as human beings just by thinking of the world in like epochs and periods and times and generations and all that kind of stuff. I mean, those are all heuristics we use to sort of put things in order, right? To bring some order to just the general chaos that is human development. And what the reality of humanity right now is, it's just an unbroken line. It's squiggly and it runs all over the place, and it's everybody all pulling in different directions with all sorts of different ideas, different approaches to things, and some things emerge dominant and then sort of trickle off and fade away, and other things emerge dominant and then trickle off and fade away. But it's all a continuous process. There's no, like, there's the age of humans, but there's no like sub ages to that. It's just, because you say, when did this generation begin, this generation end? It's arbitrary. They're just picking a line and saying, well, if you were born before this year. And I go, well, I kind of think more like this person. I was born in this year. And they go, well, but you don't count. Like, you're Gen Z and you're a millennial because you were 83 and you're 84, or whatever the cutoff is. And you go, well, yeah, but that's not how human beings work, right? And that's just not. And there is some research out there that talks about, it's more about the age cohort that you are sort of raised with. But then if you trace back to like the 1800s, you go, well, how come we group people based on age cohort? Because it was like a Prussian thing about how they educate people, and it was more about cultivating good citizens, and that was an easy way to divide people up. And I think the example they gave in that book was, like, imagine someone told you, this is what your job is going to be. You're going to come in, you're going to start your task at 8 o'clock sharp, and you're going to work on a task, and then 1 hour later, whether you're done with your task or not, you're going to get up, go to another office with a new boss, do a completely different task, and you're going to go through that whole thing, whether you're finished or not, whether you've learned anything or not, whether you've completed anything or not. You're going to stop, drop all your work, and then go to another boss in another office. All the while, you have to ask permission to move. You have to ask permission to speak. You can't even go and use your biological functions without permission. And there's going to be a bell that rings at each of these work periods where you just have to automatically go and shuffle yourself as quickly as possible. And by the way, we're just going to divide you up all by age. So everybody you work with is all going to be exactly the same age as you were within a year. And you go, do you want to take that job? You go, that sounds horrible, right? Like, I mean, it's just very, like, I don't think there are very many people that would take that job, because it's just frustrating and, annoying. But the purpose of that Prussian sort of school of thought was not to educate, but was rather to inculcate this idea of obedience, right? And learning how to be a good citizen. And I mean, in this country, we used to stand there and, like, in school, I would stand and pledge allegiance to a flag. And I go, do you know what that means when you're 6 years old? No, but they are impressing upon you that there is an all-powerful thing that you need to hold your hand over your heart and swear an oath to when you're 6. That's, and you go, yeah, that's America. And I go, is it? I mean, how libertarian is that? Swear fealty to me. You go, it's not really a libertarian principle. It's not even a freedom principle. And that sort of concept came around in the 50s. And so you can always trace back through history and start finding somebody somewhere that came up with some idea. But there's I think it's Hanlon's razor that says, look, if you have the choice between just thinking someone did something out of evil or someone did something out of incompetence, you should always trend towards incompetence. And just assume good intentions for everything, right? So you go, how did quality start declining? You go, well, it's this evil cabal of people that are greedy and they just want to extract as much value out of things as possible. Possibly, and I could see why someone would think that. And then you could also look at it and go, well, why does fiat food look the way it does? Well, because you need economies of scale to continue having prices rise and your currency devalue simultaneously. The only way to continue producing food at scale is to centralize everything. And then once you've centralized everything, the only other thing you can do is start reducing quality and finding cheaper ingredients and finding cheaper ways to do it. And right now, if you want to go get some grass-fed, grass-finished beef, and you want to have that stay competitive in a society where your currency is being devalued and the cost of everything is going up, then it's just going to cost a continuing premium, right? Like you will, like that's why the last time I bought a steak, it was $18 for a 10-ounce steak. It was grass-fed, grass-finished, and just sitting there. Whereas, just 10 years ago, I could have bought one for $10, and 10 years before that, I could have got one for $5, and 10 years before that, I could have got one for $2. So you go, are these people evil, or are they just trying to, in their self-interest, obviously, or are they just trying to capture more of those resources because that's the rules of the game? And once they've captured those resources, how do they keep getting to capture those resources once they've established that they're at sort of the top of that chain?
And if there's a flow of inflation running against your business, you're always swimming against that.
Correct.
So,
right.
Yeah.
And so that's, when Jeff Booth talks about like things should be trending towards the marginal cost of production, that's correct. And yet the structures that we've created are so fundamentally broken, and they've been fundamentally broken for hundreds, thousands of years. You go, well, what's it look like when you fix that? You go, you just can't wrap your head around what that looks like, because it's everything you understand, everything you know about the world is different. And so how does that look? You go, I don't know, man. Like, I honestly don't know. I go, would this bar exist? Would this building exist if we had just had sound money from the day of the pharaohs? Like, if the pharaohs could not just command power and there was like some sort of exchange of value thing going on, or had they not been raising goats and shepherds, or if the Native American tribes had won, or any number of things. You go, you just don't know. But this is the boat we're on right now. This is the only thing we have. We don't get to go back and experiment. We don't get to go back and change. We don't get to go back and go, well, let's all just stay hunter-gatherers and see what that looks like for a couple thousand years and see what the results are. Because we don't know how humanity would have developed under those conditions, because it didn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
Just like we don't know what it would look like if the whole world grew up on a fishing and rice diet. And maybe we'd all be China right now. And maybe I think ultimately, if you kind of look at history, you go, well, it looks like most people are pretty poor and life sucks. So there's certainly a mountain of evidence that says, hey, regardless of how much we think this sucks or how wasteful it is, it's certainly gotten better for a lot of people running this way. But the problem is they funded it all with debt. The beauty of it, though, is that we all have a perspective now. We go, what's the perspective? Well, when we did things this way, things sucked. Now we do things this way, and I can talk to you, across 1,000 miles just as easy as I can talk to you right now. Mm-hmm. And I can fly anywhere in the world in a day, and I can, see the world. And so you go, those are all amazing things. It's an amazing, beautiful thing that human beings have created. What came along with that? Well, occasionally, once in a while, we just go around and slaughter a few million people around the world and drop bombs on them, and so there's an ugly downside to it as well. You go, which is better on balance? You go, I don't know. There's a lot more people who get to live and get to experience some of the beauty of the world, and there's a lot of people that suffer from it. So it would require the mind of a god to sort of parse out if this is the right trajectory or not. And I think with AI, depending on how your flavor of, or how you approach AI, is that going to be our new god, and that's going to be the thing that's going to parse through this, or is it going to get co-opted, or is it going to, it's
what would not if it's conscious or not, but what would a very smart, somewhat aware AI with interests on, say, what time preference would an AI have, and what would an AI think of humans' role in a large system?
Yeah.
Who knows?
I would say like they would operate on the same scale that you do with an anthill. You go, I don't give a shit. Like, you literally spend exactly 0 seconds per day thinking about what the ant is feeling right now. Like, you will just step on their home without a second thought. Like, you just don't. You don't go, oh shit, think about all the poor little ants that just died, and what were their dreams, and what were they thinking about? And
you wouldn't go out of your way to stomp on it. Like, there wouldn't be malice, say, but
it's just different.
Would you squish some to make some room for something that the colony would benefit from? Yeah, I guess so. I don't know. Who cares?
You're indifferent, right? Like, yeah. And that's sort of the problem. You go, what's the time preference of something that's eternal? It doesn't have one. it doesn't care. Like, it doesn't even think that way. Like, that's a very human centric sort of way to anthropomorphize a robot.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, and I'm sort of more on the cautionary side of the AI spectrum, just because I go, well, we don't have a choice now. Like, you guys have already let the cat out of the bag, so to speak, and there are some very smart people that have said, hey, there's some things you should not be doing with this technology. And they've already done it because of the profit motivation, because of the resource capture, and because of needing to be first in competition, all that kind of stuff. So you look at those incentives and you go, those are the same incentives that brought us nuclear weapons, which are also the same incentives that brought us like cars and, you know, iPhones and everything else, and mass communication. So
I look at AI as like a force of nature that's going to just grow and run as it may, and we can worry and pontificate about it, but I just kind of like, you know what? I don't know, but I can't worry. It's like how I learned to not worry about the atomic bomb, that kind of thought.
right.
Similar with humans and human problems and humanity, I feel like we wrestle with needing to, control and direct and manage, and yet humanity it's kind of this force of nature that is occurring, and we're navigating change. And with change is a double-edged sword. If we can see all the things that have gotten worse and they're easily sold, and we can also see all these ways it's gotten better, and it's just different. But are things really worse, or is it, we just didn't know what bad was, and now we're just aware of the details, and we see, oh, things are bad. And even with improvements and stats showing, a decreased starvation rate throughout the world and increased health improvements throughout the world, things are getting better and better, but it's easy to see all the problems.
Right. Well, it's always been easier to see the problems, right? So that's it's the glass half full, glass half empty kind of paradigm. And
I try to think that, perhaps naively, but I try to maintain a positive outlook that things get better and better over time. Sort of the arc of justice bends towards, or what did Martin Luther King say? It's an improvement thought,
right.
Or that the wheel may grind slowly, but it grinds very finely, and that over time, can't help ourselves, but things get better, even though in an information age, we can be much more aware of the fact that we have problems.
Yeah.
The point you made about, was it, what was the razor? Henning's razor? Hanlon's razor.
I may have that razor wrong.
There's Occam's razor.
There's Occam's, there's Hanlon's, there's a third razor, I can't remember. But I'm pretty sure it's Hanlon's that says, you want to defer to
ignorance versus malice.
Ignorance versus malice. You want to assume good intentions, generally speaking. It helps solve a lot of problems that you'll face, not just in economics or political economy or something like that, but just in life.
Right. You're not always going to be right, but why presume the worst or make that conspiracy rabbit trail out of something that is just people being stupid?
Yeah.
And large, you get enough people in a room, and overall, it's stupid.
Yeah.
So I totally get it. I want to connect on that concept with my view on when I mentioned my parents being hippies.
Right.
And they're not hippies now. They both reformed in their own directions.
Right.
And one, my mom is very on the left side of politics. My dad has gone very right on the side of politics, and diverged from a mutual source of, feelings of revolt and independence and being young and freedom, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And then growing up, having kids, having careers, retiring, and diverging politically. Each one of them so different. I want to touch upon that. I had a story to relate to this about my parents, and it starts actually with my great-grandpa, where, as best as we know, and it's interesting because my grandpa and his dad never talked about where they came from. We know they came from Germany or southern Russia somewhere, and they were fleeing around the time of World War I. They fled that area to America. They came to America through Ellis Island, got processed on a boat, 1910-ish, and then quickly just migrated west to Nebraska,
Hmm.
became cowboys, got into horses, raising cows, selling cows, ran auction yards, and were cattlemen. And my grandpa, his dad, came over when he was 10 years old and spoke German.
Hmm.
And but they never talked about where they came from. It was like it just didn't exist. They were Americans. They
Right.
loved America. They came for reasons. Once they got here, they considered themselves, Americans.
Right.
And he didn't know where they came from. My grandpa didn't. And his dad never talked about it, or didn't know details maybe, but they just didn't talk about it. They were Americans and they were cattlemen. When World War II happened, my grandpa had been a vet working on cows largely, but worked on animals. And the draft was happening, and he enlisted in the military and was a medic, became a medic in World War II. And they fought their way through France, into Germany, into Poland. And he had severe trauma from experiences there where he had to fight for his life, defended his life, was in combat, and I would say physically and emotionally survived, but had nightmares his whole life. And I have memories of that where we'd go visit him, like we're talking in the 80s, and I was a kid, and he'd wake up at night like screaming. I'm sorry. Wow.
Oh, goodness.
Anyway, it's funny because it touched me emotionally. So as a kid, I was really into, like, I was into war. I'd wear camo. We'd play war, and the idea of war was cool. But my grandpa never talked about it. When he got older, he would share some of the lighter stories, which he enjoyed, post-war stuff. So in any case, he had to help clean up concentration camps, and it was horrible. So you imagine that generation, we call the greatest generation, coming back to a new America with when you talk about in your book, power, America's new role in the world and its capability. The financial agreements we made with Europe and the cleanup and the restoration we did across the world, and also now a new economy based upon the dollar. When you think about the greatest generation, you think about just true American patriots who knows what it means to have fought for your country. Now you can get into ideas around how the war started, what was involved there, why America got involved. There's a lot there, I know. From a personal story, we're talking about a whole generation of farmers and ranchers and hard working class people that were all in on winning on a common cause for the right reasons. What they felt at the time. And so coming out of that, you imagine a whole generation that is sort of synced up culturally on what's good and what's right. Hard times. They have memories from the Great Depression. They kind of lost about everything during the Great Depression, paying off debts and reconciling debts on their cattle business, and had to really lose a lot to survive. World War II hits, they come out of that, and surviving that, and then raising kids. Now that's my parents, my uncles, my aunts. Now we're talking about the beginning of the military-industrial complex and the intelligence complex. At a governmental level, it's a new era where America's economy had changed, mm-hmm. and its role in the world had changed. The greatest generation did not enter that thinking, when you think of the razor concept, they're not out to do bad at all. Right. They're pro-American, and they know what worked and what it took. The hippie generation then, now World War II merges into the Korean War, right. merges into the Vietnam War, right. the JFK assassination, inside connections on that. and concerns about what is going on in the world. Martin Luther King, Robert F. Kennedy, all this stuff was going down. And if I was a kid growing up in that era, I'd be like, fuck all of you.
Right.
Now I'm Gen X, and I would say that what the greatest generation gave us coming out of hard times, it was hard people. My grandpa was a strong and strict man.
Mm-hmm.
That generation, I think, both loved and gave their best to their kids.
Mm-hmm.
And it was probably a combination of strong discipline and principles with spoiling them as much as you could, depending on, every family situation.
Right.
That the boomer generation now. You've got boomers in a new world of some freedom and cultural change, and you're watching, say, the Vietnam War. In the 80s, growing up, I feel like it's easy superficially to say, man, they were just the best times. Now, we had gotten off the gold standard in 1971, and we were just experiencing kind of this unfettered available money and churn and stuff going on from that MTV and rock and roll. And I loved the 80s. My memories of the 80s and the 90s were a sense that things are good.
Right.
America, it's easy to say America's great.
Right.
We've shifted from softer and softer people. So hard times making hard people making soft times, which I benefited from unknowingly growing up in just the 80s. And then soft times creating maybe softer people bringing on harder times. And I don't want to put the burden of the responsibility of all this wheel on the people, because I feel like there are systemic things about it. Mm. But my experience with it is that every generation was doing their best that they knew at the time. Whether it was the greatest generation, the boomers, I don't criticize my parents for doing their best with what they knew. And then even today, us doing what we can as our best under our circumstances and seeing systemic problems as well as personal responsibility problems. Mm-hmm. What Bitcoin has done is provide a solution or a fix that is that transcendence to some of these problems, both systemic and personal responsibility.
Sure.
And so I feel like there could be a trend towards an arc of both justice and betterment for humanity that is rooted in our money. And that I don't want to just blame, oh yeah, boomers, or oh well, they're of this or that generation necessarily.
Sure.
But that every generation is still doing its best. And whenever I feel ideas of whether it's conspiracy or blame, I try to step back and look at it from like humanity being a force of nature of its own. It's not self-conscious of what's going on. It's just doing what it knows to do at the time with what it's got.
Sure.
So I don't judge a lot about that, but I see general trends, both good and bad, and it makes me optimistic about it, that you can judge every generation for, oh, they did that, or oh, see what that did, or oh, they did that. But what I see is the tide and the waves and the crash of an ocean tide that simply is going to do what it does, but that it's not that it's bad or that it's all good, but the trend of time is working towards an ultimate destination that is progress. Do you think it's progress, or do you worry about things just really not being good in the long term?
Well, I'll tell you, I share a lot of your point of view, really. I mean, because I'm very guilty of like saying, boomers, and I mean, there's actually a great book out there right now, like Generation of Sociopaths, and they kind of go through. I mean, the guy sort of lays out pretty systematically, I should say, how boomers were really sociopaths, you know. And
I want to argue that, but yeah, I hear what you're saying.
well, one of the things he points out is like, you know, that was the generation that routinely practiced or routinely engaged in the practice of fragging, like during Vietnam. Fragging is where lower order officer or enlisted men kill their officers because they didn't like their orders or didn't want to do what they were doing. So it's fratricide, but intentional, right? And he goes, if you look throughout the history of military service in the United States, you know, there was never a widespread practice of fratricide before the Vietnam War or after the Vietnam War. Like it happens, but it wasn't a common occurrence where they had a name for it, right? Except during the Vietnam War. And so his sort of point was like, well, they were the first generation raised on TV, and these people are just glued to the TVs. And if you look at a boomer today, they're still glued to the goddamn TV. They just cannot break free from that little like source of, you know, just direct injection propaganda.
That is one piece of all this, is that in the 50s, television became suddenly, man, you think about the kids watching their cartoons or their shows, and for them, that created their reality. This reality is what's being shown.
Yeah, 100%. And it framed social norms, social values, all that sort of stuff. I mean, it was like, it was a really weird, there's a reason like Orwell was writing about 1984 around that time, is because it's just fucking bizarre, like to have that influence on a mass scale, because there had never been anything like that. Like before that, you have to read something and reflect on it and take time to think about it. Now it's just direct injection into the brain. One of the nice things about mass communication now is it dilutes that effect so massively. I mean, you can't get a message across to somebody. The downside of that is that you get people to think the fucking earth is flat, and you know, like just, I mean, you can go completely the other direction. And so, you know, it's like all things, there's some sort of balance in there. But to answer the question, do I think it's on a net positive trajectory? I go, clearly. I mean, it's unmistakable, right? And that was, you know, there's a reason there's 8 billion people on the planet. It's not because everyone's dying and suffering. It's because people are able to live longer and make more babies, and more babies are living and things like that. Jack Mahler's just put out a thing about, you know, population declines coinciding with the 1970s, and you know, and he correlated it to, you know, the breaking of the gold standard. And I go, well, that's a thing, but you're not controlling for anything, right? And if you actually look at real population data, and this is part of the problem with complexity and what we talked about before, is like there's always something more than what it looks like, you know, and especially if you take a very simple metric like that and then just start drawing straight correlations, you go, this is the reason why. But that's how you also end up with a flat earth, you know. And what you find if you start looking at population data is go, what is the infant mortality rate in a country? You know, infant mortality declines, so does the rate of baby making, just period. If you go, hey, I had a kid, because, I mean, for the parents out there, it's a pain in the ass to raise a kid. It's not easy. You don't just go, yeah, every day is a joy. Every day is just like, God, this kid, oh my God. How did you manage to get, yeah, right? Like, sure. How did you get your toy stuck in my carburetor? Like, how? Mm-hmm. You can't, why is that thing sticking out of your ear?
This morning, my toddler was digging in the dirt and playing, and we were outside swinging and jumping on the trampoline and having fun, and next thing I know, she's got some dirt and she's throwing it in my wife's car's grill. the grill of her car. I'm like, no, let's not do that.
Yeah, let's.
Anyway,
but the point is it's not easy to raise kids, and for most of human history, the reason you'd want to have kids is like they died, and you needed the help, right? But if you go to the hunter-gatherer tribes, like you go back before, again, agriculture and animal husbandry, you go, well, how many kids did they have? Well, their birth rate was pretty steady, and they would have a higher infant mortality rate than we do now, obviously, though that's declining here in the States. But they weren't just in population explosion mode, right? But you get that population explosion when you get agriculture. And so you go, well, why is there a decline in birth rates now? Because we went off the gold standard. You go, yeah, kind of. That might be a factor in that. the more likely thing is that birth rates have come down. It's too expensive to have kids, and so there's probably a monetary aspect to it. There's probably an infant mortality aspect to it. There's a healthcare aspect to it. There's a different social orientation towards child raising. There's a different, all sorts of orientations. You go to sub-Saharan Africa, they're still making babies like it's going out of style, but their infant mortality rate is much higher. But even there, those infant birth rates are coming down. And if you went back to the 1970s, the only thing you would hear is like, oh my God, the population explosion. If we keep growing at this rate, there's going to be 14 billion people. We're all going to starve to death. And you go, well, by now. Like now is the time we're all supposed to be starving. And I'm clearly not starving. So it's...
yeah, we're blessed, aren't we?
Yeah, well, I don't know. And so it, like people that trace out things like, even Jeff Booth was talking about something. He said, well, the amount of debt we have, it's inevitably going to lead to this total collapse, and they have to print so much money to get through this. And I go, and even that, I admire that man so much, and I think he's this enormously positive influence. And I can listen to that guy talk about things, and he's definitely transformed my thinking on things, and and I can also recognize there's some bias in some of that thinking, where you go, yeah, it might spiral into this sort of massive catastrophic decline, and I'm guilty of proposing or saying, hey, this is a possibility. And I also go, the amount of momentum we have, and just the likelihood of people going like, hey, I want to give up everything we got right now so I can go fight for a cause. You go, how many people are on board with that right now? Yeah, there's a bunch of knuckleheads that'll just kind of do anything you tell them. And yet there's a lot of people that are just sort of like, I don't really want to play that way anymore.
Well, imagine the U.S. government trying to draft in this day and age.
Right.
If there was an actual war, say, yeah, you're just printing money to fund it, but you need bodies to do it. And now warfare has changed, but ultimately you do need some bodies on the ground.
Right.
And if you needed to draft, hell no, it's not happening.
Well, how's it going to work? You need to go sign up for the draft, and every single TikTok account, Twitter account, YouTube account, every social media page is going to be telling people, don't go join that. That's stupid.
Yeah.
It's going to be an overwhelming flood of like, we're not doing that.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm reminded of like the poll tax they tried to pass in Britain, and the Britons just said, we're not paying it. Like, go pound sand. And if no one shows up, you can enforce against a couple people. You can make examples out of a couple people, but right now, like I see a very clear through line, and it's also my algorithmic bubble that we're both in, and whatever lists we've now found ourselves at the NSA or wherever, because we go Bitcoin good. That's now like it's part of an FBI thing. They go, hey, if you think freedom's good, then you're enemy of the state kind of thing, and
right.
It's like
freedom itself being a flag is like, well, what kind of freedom?
Right. Yeah. Well, what you mean, the freedom where we tell you what's good for you, or the freedom where you actually have some freedom? But the broad point being, and to your point, is like, how are you going to get that draft to go? It's like, it's going to be enormously problematic for them. And not to mention, like, even if you go back to Tesla in the days of Ford and all those guys, they said, look, and Jason Lowery talks about this, he goes, sooner or later, you're going to get to a place, it's a kinetic stalemate. We're already there. And the whole world is sort of posturing around Ukraine and Russia, and saying, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. But ultimately, you go, are you, though? Because Russia will launch the nukes. They will 100%, just the same, identical, like, I don't know why this confuses people at all. Like, it boggles my mind, seriously. They go, oh, Russia wouldn't do that. And I go, you remember when the Russians put missiles on Cuba? We told them, get those out of here, or we will blow up the entire world before we'll let you put missiles in Cuba. I got my finger right on the button right now, dude. Get them out of there immediately. And everyone kind of went, ooh, oh, are they serious? I go, yeah, we are, 100%. Don't push this. And they went, okay, well, just take those back. Sorry about that.
Like, as extremist as you could say Khrushchev was, he was no dummy.
Correct. And as extremist as these, the people on our side now are acting, when Russia goes, oh, you want, okay, my finger is on the button. He's already told us. And that's a line, it's a red line. That red line's been there for 20 years. Don't expand NATO westward. And they keep doing it anyway. And you go, it's just like we drew a line and said, don't bring communism to South America. And they did anyway. And so we went and wrecked the whole goddamn continent to prevent that from happening.
Bank runs happening right now in Cuba.
Oh, yeah.
like yesterday.
Right. Well, but I mean, that's the point, is they were so unwilling to allow, communism on our door, just like Russia is so unwilling to allow NATO on their door. And so, are we going to end up in some sort of like global conflict with, who knows? John Mearsheimer has a great thing. He put it out in 2018 talking about westward NATO expansion is the problem, and stop doing
eastward?
That. Or eastward expansion, sorry. Mm-hmm. And he made a very compelling case, and there's people that argue it, and Warhawks and all these little, beady-eyed bean counters that want to talk about, like, we should be stopping Russia and this. And I just go, you guys are just academics sitting in an office bullshitting about stuff. But they're not the people that have to go fight. They're not the people that have to go die. And all of this carnage is avoidable, save for we need to pay for Lockheed Martin and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But in terms of things getting better, I go, despite all that, you go, well, things are, generally speaking. And I think that trajectory continues. And I think Bitcoin plays a crucial part in that. And what I'm getting at with the book is not that the world is going to look exactly like this except we pay in Bitcoin. Like, I think that's just a fundamentally... I think you'd have to be just a baboon to think that's the way the world's going to unfold. And to think like, hey, I'm always going to get to go down and buy mass market clothing at the Gap under a Bitcoin standard. You go, probably not, because that's probably just not how the world's going to work. Because why would it? Because all of this is predicated on fiat. So when people go, get rid of fiat, and I go, well, that means get rid of everything, because your whole world is built on fiat. Mm-hmm. So you go, well, what's it look like without fiat? I go, how the hell am I supposed to know? How could anybody possibly say what the world looks like if you get rid of fiat? Because every single aspect of our lives, from birth to death, has been in fiat, paid in fiat, purchased by fiat, created by fiat. You go, the oil tankers and the electrical grids and nuclear weapons and machine guns and tanks and bars and free-flowing beer and 46,000 microbrews and McDonald's and everything we think, do, breathe, believe was built on fiat. So you go, what happens when you get rid of it? You tell me.
I think it can all still be there with just a shifted and adjusted sense of time preference.
Yeah, well,
when you visit another country, if you're American and you go to Mexico, there's things about it that strike you as like, oh my God, like, I don't like it.
Right.
It's if you have a different time preference or sense of standards, these people are not miserable in a lot of these places I go to.
Right.
But it is a different standard. And not to make that kind of comparison, but when you think about, well, we're used to a fiat standard.
Well, Mexico is still built on a fiat standard,
and
too.
Mexico's as bad or worse of a type of a fiat standard.
Right.
But under a Bitcoin standard, I think you can have all the things we have with a different adjusted sense of who's doing what for who and what your expectations are on time preference.
Potentially, sure. Well, I mean, that's the sort of point of my book, right? Is I go, what I think having Bitcoin as a treasury reserve asset enables for people to do is to slowly realign those incentive systems, right? Mm-hmm. Because my incentive systems, and this is partly on personal experience, partly on observation, I go, everybody I've seen that gets on a Bitcoin standard, that starts saving their wealth, their productivity, if they put that into Bitcoin, the way their life looks changes slowly. But you see those guys like the Bitcoin maxis that are driving around in 1987 Toyota with duct tape on the seats, and you go, well, what's your time preference and why? And what's your incentive right now? Your incentive is not to run down and buy a brand new Jeep every year because your neighbor bought a Jeep. You don't give a shit anymore. It doesn't matter to you anymore. But that has knock-on effects, because if you go, okay, now every single Jeep owner doesn't want to buy a new Jeep anymore, what happens to Jeep? Well, they go away. There's no more Jeep.
Or they adjust their target audience and what they're building is more oriented, I would say, around a long-term quality
Potentially. Mm-hmm. And if you go, well, if everyone on a Bitcoin standard goes, you know what, I never needed a car. I never needed to travel. I never needed to do this. All I needed is a farm and a family, and I could just raise some cows, and I can use some modern implements. Like maybe I'll get the modern tractor, and all of a sudden John Deere is the most valuable company on the planet, and Tesla's out of business, and GM is out of business, or they convert their factories to tractor making. Or you see where I'm going with this, though, is like the type of economic incentives. You go, how many people want to sit in an office all day and grind emails and show up at a water cooler? And you go, zero. There's zero people that, I mean, there is somebody that just likes the habit of having somewhere to go. But
there's a lot of people that like that structure, and hey, I show up, the whistle blows, I do this, I do that.
Right.
I get paid, I go home,
Correct.
and I watch TV.
Yeah. And they're more than content to exist in that sphere. But if there's no reason to do it, then they're going to have to figure out something else, you see. So I agree with you. We can keep some of this, most of it in the short term, but sooner or later, this all, as Bitcoin becomes the thing, there's less and less reason to fiat things, and there's less and less reason to expand out on things. So it creates a lot more room for humans to creatively think about how to exist. And that's the sort of elevation that, that's the next level transformation. And especially if you continue with the AI and the automation. And even that is all predicated on fiat thinking, and it's fiat mindset that's creating automation and creating, like, I need to automate my email tasks. You go, oh, those emails that you're just not going to want to do after 10 years from now, like, why would you? We automated email, but no one cares about that anymore anyway, because there's no company to email to, because it went away, because no one ever really needed, like, this little insurance middleman ding-dong company that produces ding-dong widgets or whatever it is. It's just a lot of these industries will just naturally die out. And so if you start trying to model out, like, what does the world look like not on a fiat standard? You go, you cannot, there's no, and Jeff Booth frames this really well. He goes, there is no frame of reference for it. It's completely different.
Yeah.
So
my grandparents trying to imagine what their kids were going through, or let alone their grandkids, experienced in their lives, and the growth of the internet. The internet happens, and I have memories. My grandparents have passed away, but my grandma would ask questions when I was getting into the software industry, in the mid 90s, and she would ask questions about things, and her frame of reference was that, from when she was a girl to watching launches to the moon,
mm-hmm.
to the internet. Now this internet thing, like, it was hard for me with any amount of time and explanation for that to register.
Of course.
It just, it wouldn't, it couldn't.
Mm-hmm.
Our new generations, and say with Bitcoin, it's hard to imagine, what does this future mean?
Well, the thing I would distinguish there is, like, that entire transformation you just described occurred under fiat. The going to the moon was fiat. Getting cars and electricity, all fiat. The World War II, all fiat. The rise of the military-industrial complex, fiat. Nuclear war, fiat. Nuclear stalemate, Cold War, fiat. All under a fiat standard. So despite the fact that she was struggling to keep up with the technological changes, that still was under the same general paradigm. She still understood how the world worked. She still understood, like, oh, I go to the bank and I go to work, and you have to go to work, and I got to buy insurance, and this is where we get our medical care. This is where food comes from. This is where and they were the same basic structures. They're just more centralized as we grew, right? Like, she used to raise food maybe on a farm or something like that, but once in a while she could go down the corner store and buy a lamp, and had someone make her ox cart for her, or whatever, wagon.
The supermarket was and we're talking, when we think of supermarkets now, we're talking a grocery store where groceries were food.
Correct.
The grocery store was this amazing new thing. There were checkout stands, and you went and you found all this stuff. You didn't go to this market and that market and the butcher and all that. It was like a grocery store had all that stuff.
Yeah. But it was just a concentration of existing paradigms, right? Because she had a butcher, and she had a corner store, and she had a general goods store, and she had a dry goods store, and all that happened was they just took those and merged them. But they merged them because of fiat, and they merged them because of the way that system was developing. What I'm saying the fundamental shift here is like you go, what happens when you get rid of the system? You go like, well, if you look at a world and you go, there are no stores. You go, what? Well, how can that be? And they go, well, that's a possibility. You see what I'm saying? You go, well, how do we plan for a world with no stores? And that's where the panic starts setting in. And yet there is a possibility of a thing existing where there are no stores. Like you can just go, oh, well, food comes in this other form now, and we get it this other way that we couldn't have fathomed before because it was all predicated on building a system of distribution and productivity and all this sort of stuff predicated on inflationary fiat money.
Ultimately, are you saying is it still boils down to your community? What is your community?
No, and yes. The thing I guess I'm trying to get across is like the trap that everybody is in is to look at the world and go, when we get to Bitcoin, I'm going to get a Lamborghini, and I'm going to have this great life where I get to travel wherever I want, and I get to do this and that and the other thing. I go, the world on a sound money standard is not contemplatable. All you can do is fantasize about it. The only thing you can live in is a fantasy. If you try and plan for, like, I think it's going to look like this, you go, you can't. It's impossible. We don't have the resources, the mental capacity, or a model to even work from. Because, like, if you go back to 1700, what did you have? Well, you had a dry goods store, a general store. You had somebody that made clothes. You had somebody that made horseshoes. They traded it for currency, and then they did this. And so the system has changed. The unit of account changed. The infrastructure to support it changed. The industrialization of it changed. The mass production changed, but there's still the same basic concepts. You go, there was always someone that made this, and there's always somebody that created this, and there's always been this trade of goods and services, and the structure that we built is predicated on that model.
We live in meat space, and ultimately food, water, shelter, social interconnection, they have to happen always. It's just, how does that happen?
Correct. And if you have a sound money standard with people that are accustomed to trading, you go, well, what does that system look like? You go, would it have built up the same way that we have since the Revolutionary War with dry goods stores and centralized production and all that kind of, you go, not necessarily. What does that look like when there's a robot doing it and all this productivity enhancements and et cetera, you go, I don't know. I mean, is it the Jetsons? Because the Jetsons makes that same fundamental error. They go, oh, it's just going to be exactly like the world we live in now. George still has to go to work at Cogsley Cogs or whatever, and he's going to hop in his car-like spaceship vehicle that he individually owns, and he has his individual servant. And you go, well, maybe. Or maybe it looks like humans live in these little dome houses, and they just sort of have these gardens that magically grow because some AI created some fucking seeds that just sprout just cause, regardless of soil conditions. Or maybe it's, some other hydroponic, thing, or maybe it's, but not thinking in a fiat mindset is impossible for, I think, most, anybody really, because you can't picture it. It's like if you watch a spaceship movie and they go, oh, we're going to go fly across, but there's some guy driving the controls. You go, what fucking kind of...
There's a pilot at
a control surface. Yeah. And you go, where'd that concept come from? Well, that's the exact same idea as like someone holding reins on a horse. You go, we've not broken from that paradigm. Bitcoin changes that paradigm so fundamentally that you go, well, just imagine a world where you just move around without reins and food comes like it's a teleporter or whatever it is. You go, you can't create a structure that has never existed.
Well, if we want to say that there's a steering wheel involved in the future, and that humans are in control of it, I feel like humans have to be in control of some form of a steering wheel when it comes to what is quality. Going back to quality, that only humans can really discern and know it when they see it, what quality is. and that you can't hand it off to an AI, and the AI or another system will simply know, oh yeah, this is quality. I feel like ultimately it's a human determination.
Mhm.
And that at some level, regardless of what's automated or what robots are involved, that quality has to have that human interjected control over, no, that's not what we like for whatever reason, or no, this is what we like for whatever reason, in terms of a sense of human quality. That humans will have to have a grip on the steering wheel.
Maybe. I mean, like
Because if we don't,
well,
then that's
here's
where you go down, oh boy, we're in trouble now.
not necessarily, because I again would say that that's a product of a fiat worldview, right? Is you go, well, if we don't have this, then it's going to be this, and you go, well, but that's not the only two possibilities on this human path. And if you went back to like a Sudanese tribe in the year 5000 BC, and you go, and you tried to present to them, you go, you can't live this way. This is impossible. You have to trade using this paper, and you have to have a store to go here, and you have to have a cart so you can carry. And they look at you like you're a lunatic. You go, what are you talking about? But if they suddenly found themselves in that world, they go, they'll figure it out. They'll go, oh, I kind of see how all this shit works. It's really weird, they're still going to be sleeping on the floor, and they're still going to be looking for like, hey, well, where do I usually just go down and pluck a thing off a bush and I shoot a, where are those things? And they go, we stopped doing that. Like, you know what I'm saying?
I guess as long as humans have a choice in the matter.
Well, that's what I'm getting at, is it's not so much about like choices as it is about how incentives align and then how people adapt to them. Right, and it's that process of adaptation that I'm trying to parse out in the book as best I can, and even as we're talking about this stuff, I go that process of adaptation, going from, we've got 5,000 years of fiat thinking, 5,000 years of power hierarchies based on I get to hold some stuff through violence and you do not, and then you go, what happens when you fundamentally change the ability of all human beings to operate under that system, given the fact that they've already got 5,000 years of history to look at? You go, what kind of world do you build? You go, holy shit, I don't know, man. It could very well become these little isolated communities. They go, hey, we're really into just like living off the land. And there could be these super high tech people that really keep exploring that. The idea that it has to be mass produced and mass adopted by everybody, I think is fundamentally flawed. Because you go, why would everyone do that when you don't have to? We have to do that right now because that's the structure that overrides our map there. That's the structure that we're living under. That's the anthill. That's the anthill colony. If you suddenly gave the ants all this self-determination and no need for leadership, and they're all sort of sovereign in their ability to preserve what they consider to be quality or to be valuable, how does humanity trace out? What happens when there is no incentive to take power? What happens when there is no incentive to capture resources? What happens when there is no incentive to lever against somebody? What happens if there is no problem with freeloading? What happens, what does society look like? Do we need nations? Do I need to be an American still? Do we need to have borders? Do I need to have border controls? Do I need to, like, all of these things you look at this thing that's built on vapor, and everybody
Those would start to taper away, I would think.
Of course, because they stop making sense.
And
right?
I think any systems that are providing services or supports to people are going to have to be quite responsive to the desires of individuals, perhaps.
Potentially. I mean, and that's the beauty of it, is we don't know. We can't know. And if you just go back to Hanlon's razor and go, most people have good intentions. Most people don't want to step on other people's toes. And if there's no incentive to do so, you cut down on that by 99%. So there's the 1% of assholes that everyone can kind of recognize as an asshole. And then how everybody governs themselves starts to look very different. And you go, maybe it's a hybrid model where you have like this sort of advanced, technologically adept society that lives and governs themselves much closer to what Native American tribes did, or maybe much closer to the way Amazonian Indians do, or maybe much closer to the way ancient Chinese villagers did, or maybe their governance structures will look like that, and they'll have this sort of cool technology stuff around. We don't know. Or maybe it will be a top-down structure where they sort of permeate all this out, and we still have banks and and trade, and you still have to go to your job. I don't know, but there is no model for a world on a sound money standard, and there is no model for having an incentive structure that doesn't require force, coercion, private property, like physical meat space private property. Because you go, where's your property? Because right now, when people talk about private, I don't want my property rights. I go, well, that's granted to you. That's not yours. And that comes from the sovereign. If you talk about the ultimate property right, aside from your life, and your life is not yours. You are subject to the state, period. 100%. They can come grab you off the street, force you to go do something. Absolutely,
What about
without
my life,
question.
liberty, pursuit of happiness, property?
It doesn't exist.
It's a parchment guarantee, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a paper guarantee, right? And your land, you go, this is my land. You go, okay, how can we pay tax on it? And what about eminent domain? What does eminent mean? Overseeing, godlike, domain, mine. So the state, the sovereign, holds your land. So you go, you can't have that property because it's not yours to begin with.
It makes me think of Douglas Adams and the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and it's like, hey, the Earth is in the way of our supergalactic highway. So
Right.
you didn't go to the protest hearing we had on the planet of Vulcan, a couple of years ago.
Right.
So no, we're paving this
Yeah.
path through your planet. Sorry.
Yeah.
I'll if I can show you this on the graph here. There's the
You should just cut it in.
the wheel of power and control, and you may be in an abusive relationship. The perpetrator won't let you go out without permission, monitors your phone and emails, controls your finances, controls what you read, watch, and say, monitors everything you do, will punish you for breaking rules, but the rules keep changing, tells you that it's for your own good and that they know better. You can't question it. They tell you you're crazy, that people don't agree with you, gaslight you, question your memory of your own events, dismiss your opinions. And it's the wheel of power that perpetrators of domestic violence or domestic abuse will do to victims. And the person on the other side, a survivor, is grappling with this sense of like feeling crazy.
Right.
And there's what is it, the Stockholm syndrome, where
Right.
when you're in that kind of a situation and a relationship, you love the person controlling you,
Right.
or you become accustomed to it or learn to integrate with it, where it can be quite protective, quite loving, but you are controlled.
Mm-hmm.
The meme that I saw edited, it just replaced the wheel of power and control. Instead of that, you may be in an abusive relationship. You may be in an abusive government if they do all of those same things. Where when you think about, am I going to get canceled here or there, or do I have freedom of speech if I say that freedom is this and they say freedom is that? Some of these same things apply in my mind. Where are there people in the world today that are in an abusive relationship from an abusive government?
Yeah, everybody.
I think we have it pretty good in a lot of ways in America. I know other countries are certainly worse, but even here in America, you take a lot for granted, like, oh, land of the free, home of the brave. Well, with caveats.
Many. Yeah.
That came to mind for me, where it was like, gee, not that I'm overtly oppressed. Then again, when COVID came around, gee, you better check in and with your privilege here and there and fit in and do what's expected.
Right.
Whatever makes sense. This is the latest rule here. So it was definitely a cultural adjustment for a while on terms of, no, you do this, you do that. Well, why? Because the latest theory on things,
Right.
which evolved and changed, and the rules now this, the rules now that. When they, in hindsight, you can easily judge it, but it's like they don't know what the fuck they're doing.
Clearly, yeah. Well, they never do. I mean, and again, that also traces back. There are people, like I don't know what Fauci is up to. Clearly, he's got some connections with that lab, and when there's probably a massive financial incentive there. And you can also look at the guy and go, well, is he evil or is he incompetent? And you go, well, chances are high that he's probably incompetent more than.
And I think that can be incentivized by, sheer financial gain potentials, corrupt people's ignorance. And it's not that they're out to do evil, but I think people get corrupted by,
Well, they end up being evil. You see what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. Like, you can be incompetent right through to evil,
Sure.
And there's a video on YouTube right now. You can go find it where they do the little train experiment, right? Do you switch the track, you kill one person, or you kill three? Right? Like, and you're in control of the train. That's a very old psychological experiment, and people on a piece of paper will go, oh, I'll pick one, right? I would kill the one person to spare the 3 or the 5 or the 10 or whatever. And so they created this experiment where they said, hey, we want you to come down and we're going to show you this train operation or whatever. And they leave the person alone in the room and they go, yeah, look here, this is how you switch the tracks and this is what you can do. And you can see there's this camera here and there's some workers over here. There's some workers over here and there aren't any trains running right now. So don't worry about it. Everything's fine. Oh, I need to step out real quick. Just sit here and and you can kind of play with stuff if you want, but you don't have to touch anything. Don't worry, you can't hurt anything right now. And all of a sudden, they hear over the radio, oh my God, there's a train live. Is anyone in the control room? They go, yeah, I'm here. They go, oh my God, well, the train's coming and it's going to hit these 10 people. You can switch the track. I mean, they sort of set them up, right? And the overwhelming response from everybody was to do nothing. They just go, they look for help, they seek authority. Hey, the train's coming, and they just let the train run over people. They just wouldn't make a decision. And I think the further you trace out, it's the Pareto principle. There's 80% of people are going to sit and do nothing. They're just going to follow whatever.
Or the Meldrum experiment. I want to say it was the Meldrum experiments where you apply a shock to a person who starts to complain and get injured, but you have an authority, any kind of little authority that just says, no, just follow the process,
right.
And the people will push the button
until they kill somebody.
Because they're like, well, they told me to.
Correct. And so that's the twofold problem you have is most people will defer to authority. And if there is an absence of authority, they will devolve to inaction. They'll just sit there and watch bad shit happen. So that's what incompetence looks like, right? Now, if you exist in a fiat system that allows that type of incompetence to keep scaling power hierarchy ladders, you end up with people pretty widely dispersed throughout a society that are incompetent, seeking approval from authority, and are incapable of taking action in the face of bad things. So if you get someone like the people at the National Institutes of Health or whatever, or you get President Trump even, they're looking for some sort of authority. Trump just was not a leader during that whole thing. He did not stand up and say, we're not doing this, we're going to do it this way. He was just like, somebody tell me what to do because I don't want everybody to die because I might not get elected
he brought in
again.
Fauci.
And yeah, he brought in Fauci.
They started Operation Lightspeed, and granted, there was a lot of unknowns there, like what is this? How bad is it? We don't know. I was like, well, shit, the people need an authoritative answer here.
Correct. And there was one. It's the United States Constitution says we don't do anything that he did. Period. Like
I would agree with that.
It's unmistakable. Like that is the very clear authority. You don't have the authority to tell people you can't leave your house. We don't have the authority to force people to do vaccinations or wear masks or put these mandates in. We're not going to allow states to do that because that far exceeds their authority under any sort of reasonable, rational.
You're going to lose your job unless you
follow
take our personal medical
right
into your
so but that's the point, is that's what incompetence looks like, right? And that's, he had good intentions. I don't think he was evil. I don't think he was like, I want to destroy the economy. He clearly didn't. His incentives were absolutely the opposite of that, which is why he ended up with all that mishmashed messaging about what we should be doing. Here's Operation Warp Speed. Here's the shop, but don't take it because I'm doing ivermectin. And he's, you go, what the heck are you doing up there, buddy? Like, how are you trying to tug out both sides of your mouth because you want to hang on to your voter base and you want to make it look like you're the strong man in charge, and you want to make it look like you're trying to, you go, that's not leadership. That's incompetence, looking for authority and not taking appropriate action. And that traces back to the Milgram experiment. That traces back to the little train thing. Hypothetically, someone will say, yeah, I'd switch the tracks to save the 10 to kill the 1. When you put them in the seat, they go, somebody help! I guess all 10 people got squished. Oops. You're incompetent. Period. Right.
Similarly, I think of the Stanford experiment. I'm trying to remember the name of that professor, but where they had the prisoners and inmates.
Yeah, since debunked, but anyway.
Exactly. So my point about that was that the idea that, well, people are always going to argue, fight, power about, people are going to take power and oppress those that don't have it.
Right.
In the Stanford experiment, it's like basically, and maybe you mentioned this before, but basically they were getting along fine up until a point where they were kind of just bored and looking for stuff to do, and they were prompted by the professor running the experiment, well, do something here, act more like this.
Right.
And so the COs started acting more brutish,
right,
and order them around. Hey, do some push-ups, do this, and they made up rules. And then they went with that. Oh, see, people who are given power act brutish. People who have power taken away are oppressed.
Right.
Totally debunked.
Right.
They wanted to just kind of get along, and it's like after a while, it was like, what is the point of this, or what are we looking for here? What are we doing?
Yeah, nothing.
And we're bored.
Yeah.
And the experiment was warped because it was imposed upon them that, hey, you need to make something happen here.
Correct.
And then instead of people just getting along, the people who had been given a label were like, well, okay, I'll do what you say. It's for the experiment.
Right. Well, and what if you boil that down to its logical conclusion, you go, what happened? They changed the incentive structure through authority. You go, oh, so absent an incentive from an authority, people generally got along. Right? Even in a prisoner officer power imbalance scenario, they just kind of got along. Everyone sort of accepted their role and they kind of did what they were supposed to do, and there was no conflict until someone changed the incentive structure.
Mm-hmm.
And that traces all the way back to what we were talking about earlier. I go, what's the incentive structure right now? The incentive structure is to take power, and that fundamentally changes how every human being's interacted with each other since. What happens when you take away that incentive? I don't know, man. I think it's going to be awesome. I just don't think it's going to look like this.
That's where I see Bitcoin has a potential to work its way into these power structures and systems in a way where people have an outlet. The monetary system has different incentives, and that people aren't going to just rely on these same types of power structures. It's going to erode all that, and more individually, people who are empowered are going to say, why though? Who gives you the authority? Actually, you don't have that authority, and I think it'll be gradually, but I think the main power structures struggle and fight as they will, and that could be quite dramatic in its own way.
Maybe.
I see them fighting. I see them making headlines or press releases about things, but it's kind of a kabuki theater. It's a show.
Well, they still have the same incentives, so that's why it's happening. And with Bitcoin gradually working its way through the system, like you just described, sooner or later those start to become more and more meaningless. It starts to become, because like right now, I watched Marjorie Greene and that other lady in Congress. They're sitting there bickering back and forth and just acting like children. And probably in the past, 10, 15 years ago, it would have been outrage and these disgusting and this and that. And how can these people call them, there's a lot of people out there expressing that kind of thing. This is an embarrassment. And I look at it and I go, no, it's just a couple children that are right on the cusp of losing power. Like they're right on the cusp of being irrelevant people. I'm in Congress. Nobody gives a shit.
I think when you're a politician, you're putting on a show. You get used to that. You're playing your role, if you will.
Well, but that's the point, is they can continue playing that role, but sooner or later it becomes obvious that it's a role. Like to me, I look at it and go, it's just nothing. This means nothing. It's not even worth looking at or talking about or commenting on or anything. I just go, hey, I think I did comment on it, but the thing being is, once that the incentive structure is already changing. Every Bitcoiner knows their incentive structure has changed and their life has changed accordingly. Every person that gets onto the Bitcoin standard is gradually going to see their incentives change, and they're going to gradually put their time and effort and energy into something that doesn't align with the current structure. And that's going to happen more and more, and it's going to spread out further and further. And eventually, even the people that are trying to cling to those power structures are going to look increasingly clownish and cartoonish, and you're just going to go, do you realize that you don't have that anymore? It's just gone.
Mm-hmm.
And then how the world coalesces and works around that, I think, looks very different. I think a lot of this stuff starts to kind of evaporate. And you may well see like cities start to become abandoned and turned into something else. And people may find some unique and creative uses for those spaces or those structures or all that kind of stuff. I just don't think we're going to see like a world of trucks and shipping containers and, this and that and the other thing. But I think there are going to be some structures that people really value, and they're going to continue to go, hey, telecommunications are pretty cool. Airplanes are kind of cool. I don't know, we'll keep those going. And we really enjoy this part of the world, and we're going to hang on to that. The rest of the shit we don't really need anymore, because nobody's really going out and buying clothes. Just like nobody's going out and buying CDs. They just sort of went away. And there was all sorts of doom and gloom and fear amongst all the people in the film and TV industry. Like, oh my God, but it didn't. It just slowly changed into what it is now. Mm-hmm. Because the incentives changed. Their incentive structure used to favor production and distribution. Now it just favors marketing, right?
Yeah, I feel like there'll be this show going on, sort of like nighttime cable news or cable TV that's like infomercials anymore. That it's on. There are 1,000 channels playing something and nobody's watching. Huh. And this show will go on with people posturing and puffing and making drama like a soap opera, and just people aren't going to be tuning in. And then meanwhile, individuals in small communities are doing their own thing just fine. And so the show can go on somehow, however they afford themselves to pay their own salaries or whatever that is. And they pass laws and they do things, and people are like, okay, what does that mean? Does anything change for me? Maybe no, probably no. Who's enforcing that? It'll just sort of either fade or have to reaccommodate or change somehow. I don't know what that looks like, but
well, it's already happening. I mean, we're watching it right now.
Yeah, I guess it's happening, and I just don't. That's the thing. I'll hear these. Like the mainstream news will be like, do you know what so-and-so just said? Or like the argument you said, these two congressional leaders got in a fight in Congress over something. And I'm like, that has nothing to do with any interest of mine at all. Right. And ultimately they can make a decision or fight, or somebody wins or loses. Maybe it's the wrapping around what we have, but it's not what's inside the box that we have. I don't know.
Well, I mean, I think that's the beauty of it all, is we get to see what, human beings are capable of, and rather than what they're capable of in confinement. And it's a whole different world, right? So legacy media is dead. It's already dead. They just haven't quite realized it yet. Like, they're still sort of chugging along on life support, but
Financially, they'll have to.
well, they're already done. I mean, they just
Yeah.
laid off, like, all the major newspapers just went through this massive round of layoffs. They were out crying and complaining about, hey, journalism dies in darkness. Like, hey, you guys are just doing a bullshit job that nobody cared about. Nobody cares about now. And nobody cares that you're out of a job. Like, you're going to have to go and figure out how to be productive somehow, or you're going to figure out how to eat and all kinds of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And that's going to be true across the economy, across the globe. So, but I think it results in a more coherent world, a sort of more open world, and a world that just looks and feels and operates very different. And I'm not saying I'm going to easily make that transition, because I don't know any better than you do what it's going to look like. And I don't doubt there will be some friction along the way. And yet, I have very high confidence that if you get that incentive structure changed, if Bitcoin remains decentralized and secure and takes over as a base layer for an economic unit, and then trade, value exchange, values, morals, all that stuff slowly realigns around cooperation versus competition, because it kind of has to.
Personally, I would like believing in patriotism and America as an idea. And now this is maybe my old school thinking about it, my fiat thought processes. But it's like I'm pro-American, and I want America to be pro-Bitcoin. I think Bitcoin's good for America, and America could be good for Bitcoin, and ultimately will be. But this kabuki theater may be just going on in the background. Meanwhile, America needs to be pro-Bitcoin. And Jason Lowry has recently been more active on Twitter again, and he can't say the word Bitcoin,
right,
but he can talk about power storage and technology and things. So he wrote that book, Soft War.
Mm-hmm.
I have not read it myself. You have it. You've read it. I wish it was. It's not being sold, I don't think, anymore.
Yeah,
but maybe it'll come back published again. But his main point, and you know better, but is that Bitcoin represents that territory, sphere of control as a strategy to a nation state economically needing to be in on Bitcoin so that you're not left out and behind economically. That Bitcoin is not just, some money value or treasury to have, but it's a power position, it's a power posturing globally when you think about an asset to be involved in and to protect.
Right.
So at one level, I feel like the puppet show can go on and make its dramas and headlines, and it has no effect on, like, what are you going to do? Make a draft? You're going to draft us for a war? Because we're not doing it. Or you're going to go crazy here because we're just not going to participate. And then if you want to enforce it, how do you do that if I'm more free? But at the same time, I would like, if America is going to have a treasury of it as a nation state, I'd like them to be in on Bitcoin.
Sure.
Does Jason's software ideas apply to where things are going in the long term? Does that matter as a nation having an in on Bitcoin?
Oh, I would characterize it differently. I would say maybe in the short term, very, very short term. Long term, like I said before, I don't think people can really comprehend what the world looks like. I really don't. In the short term, these structures are going to persist somewhat. But if Bitcoin's on the treasury of the Fed, for instance, it changes their incentive structure. If it's carried by all the major banks, it changes their incentive structure. If it's carried by all the major corporations, it changes their incentive structure. So if their incentives are realigned and they're pointed in a different direction, because right now, the entirety of that incentive structure revolves around capturing and utilizing as much debt and fiat as possible. So if there is a way to shift that mode of thinking then you go, well, what's the purpose of, like, why do we need to do this process versus this process? You go, well, there is no, we did this process because we were trying to keep up with inflation. We don't have to do that anymore because we have something that's keeping up with inflation. Oh, so what should we focus on now? Well, why don't we focus on this because that's the only place we can grow, right? And so if you start talking about warfare, conflict, protecting property and property rights, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, territorial rights, egalitarian access to land, air, sea, naval power, et cetera, you go, well, that's all based on fiat, right? Like all those structures exist because of fiat, in defense of fiat, for fiat.
Mm-hmm.
So what happens when fiat isn't the thing that you're trying to defend, protect, fund, create, et cetera, et cetera? You go, well, then you probably don't need a lot of that stuff.
Yeah.
So how does the world look then? You go, different,
1 year ago, I mean, honestly, almost exactly 1 year ago, and Jason Lowry, working for Space Force, was putting out his book and talking about Bitcoin as a strategic national defense, an asset
a national
to have,
priority.
a national
right.
priority. And it changed my paradigm at the time. Like, oh my goodness, I totally get that now. I was looking at Bitcoin from, a person's, all the things about what is money.
Yeah.
And now it became, oh, it's a national strategy. And that shifted my mindset about it.
Mine too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's not that I disagree with it, but I think with time and stepping back and looking at it all, when I think about the Great Realignment, there is a role for that for nation states and Bitcoin. But like you said, bigger picture, all that may become less relevant as well.
Correct.
Because as much as I respect Jason Lowry, there's this funny little thing I have about, man, you're working for Space Forces, and what is the whole construct behind what that branch of the military does for America, among the other branches, among the Defense Department, for a government that does all this crazy shit that I just categorically don't give a crap about.
Right.
Or that I feel like works against a lot of things that could be pro-American. Not that there aren't global interests that America has, but so many times it's like, what is Ukraine? What is our interest in Israel? What are we doing here and there? And oh my goodness, why?
Right.
It doesn't jive with my personal feelings about what is pro-American.
Right.
Now, the Space Forces being that little sliver of that, do we want a presence and some, human national interest in that? Sure. But as the Great Realignment occurs, all of that propped up, like going to the moon and waging this war and that war and being present here and there and everywhere, global police force. What has that been supported by? Fiat.
Right.
Fiat. So as fiat devolves and fails to work, and Bitcoin works and continues to work better,
right,
the national strategic interests, like, boy, I guess getting in on Bitcoin helps maintain that, and maybe it reorients it in a better way. But if it doesn't do that, or doesn't do it well, it just relegates itself to being less and less relevant, I suppose.
Well, I think it may buttress that notion, but again, the fundamental approach I'm looking at these days is if all this is predicated on property, territory, land, sovereignty, sovereign states, sovereign rule, all that is predicated on very, very old paradigms and ways of thinking about things, how humans should interact and trade. And if you ultimately recognize, like right now, if the United States of America marches down to Cuba, just goes, we're going to take all our armed forces, we're going to do a naval blockade, and we're going to invade you and then take over your land. Who's going to stop us?
Russia?
Are they?
Do they still have an interest there? I don't know.
You think Russia's going to float some warships over here and get engaged in a naval battle 6,000 miles from there, anywhere?
Nowadays, I would guess possibly not. But then again, I don't know.
I would say no, they're not. 100%. Are they going to start a nuclear war to save Castro's Cuba?
Times have changed since, yeah.
They wouldn't have done it back then anyway. They withdrew, right? The
They
point
had a
being,
battleship there, but
the point being is they wouldn't. We could just go take Cuba, is what I'm
sure.
getting at. Which means Cuba doesn't really have sovereignty. We marched right into Iraq and said, "We're here now. We're sovereign." Oh, not in the green zone, not in this city, not here, not here. So we just go and violate sovereignty all the time through force of arms. Now, you know, if Afghanistan and Iraq, they didn't want us there, so that makes it problematic. But in a place like Cuba, where you can just go, no, we don't care if you want us here. And if we were really violent about it, we just said, you know what? We don't care if you don't like it. If you don't get on board, we're going to start executing people on the street. Then pretty soon people are going to go, yeah, America. You know, they're going to be waving our flags and we'll say, hey, Cuba's the 51st state, welcome aboard. But nothing is preventing us from doing that. Quite literally nothing, other than pieces of paper that said we're not supposed to. You know, maybe the UN will vote and say bad America, but that didn't stop us from doing all the other shit we do. So my broad point being, Cuba doesn't enjoy any property rights. In the face of overwhelming force, they will lose their property rights. Just like Taiwan, in the face of overwhelming force, will lose its territorial sovereignty, whether to the United States or to China. They're going to be beholden to a larger force, period, one way or the other. Just depends on who wins the fight. So if no government can lay claim to that, let's say Russia was the first one to harness a super AI, and the super AI came up with a way that could just overwhelm all American military might with one button click. You go, well, what happens to America's sovereignty? Well, it goes away, pretty much. Like, the AI taught Vladimir Putin how to push a button and it would disable every weapon in America. And it doesn't work anymore. Well, they can just come and take America, because what are we going to do to stop them? They have the all-powerful weapon. We don't. We lose, period. So we lose America. So there's no territorial sovereignty there, because the only way we maintain is through force of arms. So how can Russia take your Bitcoin? Can't. You can't do it. So the only piece of property any entity on planet Earth, any human being on Earth can own, truly own, and not have it be seized, is Bitcoin. So you go, if that's the only property right you can enjoy, that's the only property right you own, that's the only property you can own, then what's the rest of the world look like? You go, well, what's your borders mean? Because I don't care if I have land in your border, because my property is in the beautiful, shining Cyber City. So that's where the property is, right? And that is granted by hash power, and that's the thing protecting your property rights, is a distributed network of hash power and nodes, and so it changes notions of what borders mean. It changes notions of what sovereignty means. It changes notions of everything. So do we continue to exist in structures that are reliant upon pieces of paper, when the only property anybody can truly own without having to pull a gun on somebody or fighting over it? The only thing where you can maintain egalitarian zero trust access is Bitcoin. You go, well, where's all the power? Where does all the power coalesce then? The thing that controls Bitcoin. Oh, well, what's that? The internet. You go, oh, so all power is contained in the only zero trust egalitarian access thing that anybody can get into. So everybody's powerful if you have it. Yes. Mm-hmm. Oh, so how do I wield power over you if you're powerful, just as powerful as me, because you have egalitarian access, zero trust access to the only source of power on the planet? Like not power like electricity, but power like ability to influence others' power. Mm-hmm. You go, well, that changes everything, like fundamentally, right? And so the thing I really appreciated about Jason Lowery's work was the notion of zero trust egalitarian access to property rights. Mm-hmm. He looks at it because he's a hammer. He's looking at it like a nail, and he wants to hammer it like a nail. Mm-hmm. I look at it and I go, well, it's a defensive structure, and it's a Second Amendment right. It's a weapon, and it's just like gunpowder and this and that. I go, it's bigger than that. It's different than that. I think it underestimates the power contained in it. Mm-hmm. And like I said, if is the source of power in the world, and everybody can have a piece of power in the world, then what does the world look like? There are no people that have no power.
Mm-hmm.
You go, we're all in kind of equal footing. Right.
Yeah, it short circuits that previous legacy view on what power is.
Correct.
So
that's the realignment ultimately that I'm kind of getting at with this, is like, if power is property and command of territory and things like that, ultimately, and the ability to compel people within a territory and things like that, if you strip away that authority, that power source, that power base, control of territory, property, and the people within it, then the world people stop paying as much attention to like how they defend their property, because they don't have to worry about it anymore.
mm-hmm.
So you go, well, what do I need? You can't take my property from me. Come take my Bitcoin, Fritz. You go, I can't do that. I go, I know. Neat, huh? You could take my house right now. You could take my car. All you got to do is put a bullet in my brain. That car is yours.
Mm-hmm.
No problem. Property rights have changed.
Yeah.
You know?
So with Bitcoin, yeah, you're free to navigate all the old ideas around what it means to have stuff and power.
It strips it all away.
It strips it all away.
Yeah.
So
completely.
With that, on a surreal tone, May 22nd coming up is Bitcoin Pizza Day, and I have some props here. We got some pizza here. You might have noticed the pizza boxes back here. Speaking of fiat food, I love pizza, but 2 pizzas were bought for 10,000 Bitcoin, which is now, I don't know, $1 trillion. No, it's like a
700 million.
$700 million. So
expensive pie.
that's expensive pizza, and Bitcoin Pizza Day is celebrated as looking at Bitcoin history, just the surreal view on where Bitcoin has come, and that back in the day, Bitcoin was viewed as, hey, what price does it have? I don't know. Hey, will you sell me 2 pizzas for 10,000 Bitcoin?
Yeah.
Sure.
Right.
So
the market was set.
The market was set. It gave Bitcoin a price. It started a mechanism to get it a number on the exchanges, and it gave it a price. Back in the day, it was different than it is now, and it's continuing to evolve. It was early then, and
Still
it's early
now. Yeah.
So here we are, early in Bitcoin, talking crazy. I think this is a good spot to wrap up our episode 4 for our Bitcoin Liberty Live podcast here at Liberty Tapworks. Thanks for joining us today, and I think we'll wrap it up. Thanks,
Doodles.
folks. Bye.